The courtroom didn't erupt. It didn't gasp. It didn't whisper. It froze. The kind of freeze that only happens when everyone in the room understands at the exact same moment that something irreversible has just been said. The cameras kept rolling, red lights blinking quietly. The audience sat perfectly still. Even the bailiff stopped shifting his weight, because the man standing in front of Judge Judy had just leaned forward, lowered his voice, and crossed a line that most people never even think about touching. "You don't understand who you're dealing with." He didn't shout it. He didn't snarl. He said it calmly, casually, like a warning delivered by someone who had issued many of them before and watched them work. His name was Thomas Shelby, and the confidence in his posture said he believed those words carried power. His hands rested loosely on the podium. His shoulders were relaxed. His eyes weren't pleading. They were measuring, calculating, the look of a man who thought intimidation was simply another tool in the box. For half a second it almost felt like the room itself held its breath. Judge Judy didn't react. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't interrupt him. She didn't even blink right away. She sat perfectly still in her chair, eyes locked on him, expression unreadable. That silence was louder than any objection, louder than any gavel strike. Because in that silence, something shifted. The balance of power that Thomas Shelby thought he controlled began to slip, and he didn't even notice. What he didn't know, what no one on his side of the courtroom knew, was that those 7 words would follow him for the rest of his life. Because that moment, right there, would be replayed millions of times. It would end his reputation. And over the next 7 minutes, Judge Judy would dismantle him so completely that viewers across the country would describe it the same way: calm, surgical, and devastating. But none of that was visible yet. At that moment, Thomas Shelby still believed he was in charge. He believed the threat had landed. He believed Judge Judy would react the way others always had, defensive, cautious, maybe even rattled. He straightened slightly after saying it, as if waiting for the effect to register. It didn't. Judge Judy finally moved. Slowly. Deliberately. She glanced down at the papers in front of her, adjusted them by less than an inch, and then looked back up at him. Her expression wasn't angry. It wasn't shocked. It was something far more dangerous. It was patient. The audience sensed it immediately. This wasn't a judge being challenged. This was a judge allowing someone to reveal who they really were. Somewhere in the background, you could hear the faint hum of the courtroom air system. No one coughed. No one shifted. Because everyone felt it. This wasn't going to end the way Thomas Shelby expected. The narrator's voice cuts through the stillness, steady and certain. What you're about to witness isn't just a threat gone wrong. It's a man exposing himself in real time. Because when someone tries to intimidate a judge on camera, they're not showing strength. They're showing fear. And Thomas Shelby had just shown far more than he realized. This was the moment his story stopped being about a case and started being about character. The next 7 minutes would turn into one of the most replayed Judge Judy moments ever, not because of yelling, not because of chaos, but because of what happens when absolute authority meets misplaced arrogance. Viewers wouldn't remember the paperwork. They wouldn't remember the claim amount. They would remember this sentence, this pause, this look. But here's the part that makes this moment truly unforgettable. Thomas Shelby thought the threat was the start of the confrontation. In reality, it was the end of his leverage. Because while he was busy reminding Judge Judy who he thought he was, she already knew exactly who he was, and she had known since that morning. She had seen something. Something he never expected anyone in that courtroom to see. Something that made his threat not just empty, but catastrophic. And the moment she decided to reveal it, everything in that room was going to change. Thomas Shelby didn't walk into the courtroom like a man defending himself. He walked in like a man attending a meeting he already believed he'd won. His suit was perfectly tailored, the kind that sits on the shoulders without a single crease, dark and understated but expensive enough to announce status without needing to brag. A gold watch caught the light every time he moved his wrist, subtle but deliberate. Everything about him suggested control, comfort, familiarity with rooms where other people get nervous. He stood at the podium with a loose posture, weight shifted casually to one side, as if the courtroom were just another office he'd stepped into between appointments. This wasn't his first time facing authority. And it showed. From the moment the case began, Thomas acted like procedure was optional. When Judge Judy asked him a question, he didn't answer directly. He reframed it. When she asked him to be brief, he spoke longer. When she raised a finger to stop him, he smirked, just slightly, as though the gesture amused him more than it warned him. People like Thomas Shelby learn early that confidence can masquerade as credibility. He had spent years discovering that if you spoke firmly enough, loudly enough, most rooms would bend. Lawyers would hesitate. Opponents would retreat. Bureaucrats would look for an exit. Intimidation, for him, wasn't emotional, it was transactional. A tool that had delivered results over and over again. And today, he fully expected it to work again. He interrupted Judge Judy more than once, sliding comments into the gaps between her sentences, correcting her phrasing as if this were a negotiation instead of a courtroom. Each time she cut him off, he leaned back slightly, lips curling into a thin, confident smile. Not defiant. Worse. Amused. At one point, when she reminded him to answer the question asked, he exhaled through his nose and muttered something about how this didn't need to get complicated. It wasn't loud enough to be blatant, but it was loud enough to be heard. Loud enough to be intentional. The kind of comment meant to test boundaries without openly crossing them. Then came the line that told everyone exactly how Thomas Shelby saw himself. He mentioned people he knew. Not names. Never names. Just implications, connections, influence, the kind of vague power people use when they want others to fill in the blanks for them. He spoke about things he could make happen, about how this situation could become unpleasant if it dragged on. His tone stayed calm, measured, almost polite, but the message underneath was unmistakable. I don't lose. And I don't like being challenged. The narrator's voice makes it clear what the audience is already beginning to feel. This wasn't confidence born of innocence. This was confidence built on a history of getting away with things, of watching rules bend when pressure was applied, of learning that consequences were negotiable if you pushed hard enough in the right direction. He had done this before, and it had worked before. You could see it in the way he stood, the way he spoke, the way he barely glanced at the opposing party. This was a man who believed the courtroom was a stage, and he had come prepared to perform dominance, not accountability. What Thomas Shelby didn't understand was that Judge Judy wasn't watching his words. She was watching his behavior. Every interruption, every smirk, every sideways comment. She wasn't reacting because she didn't need to. She was letting him talk, letting him settle deeper into the illusion that his status still mattered here. That illusion was the trap, because the very confidence he relied on, the posture, the tone, the subtle threats, was quietly building the case against him. The audience could feel it forming, piece by piece, like pressure behind a locked door. The more he spoke, the more certain it became that this was not a misunderstanding or a momentary lapse in judgment. This was who he was. And for the first time in his life, Thomas Shelby had brought that attitude into a room where power didn't flinch, didn't negotiate, and didn't care who he thought he was. It had protected him everywhere else, but not here. Judge Judy did not raise her voice. She did not tighten her jaw. She did not respond to the threat at all. She sat exactly where she had been moments before, hands resting calmly in front of her, posture unchanged. Her face showed no anger, no surprise, not even irritation. If anything, her expression grew quieter, more focused, the kind of stillness that unsettles people who are used to provoking reactions. Thomas Shelby mistook that silence for hesitation. He had seen this pause before, in boardrooms, in negotiations, in rooms where pressure made people retreat. He assumed this was the moment where authority recalibrated, where someone decided how far they were willing to go. He leaned back slightly, confident the message had landed. But Judge Judy wasn't recalibrating. She was observing. Her eyes stayed on him, not hard, not hostile, just steady. She watched the way he shifted his weight, the way his hand brushed the edge of the podium, the way he filled the silence with his own confidence. She had presided over tens of thousands of cases, and she knew something that men like Thomas Shelby never seemed to understand. People who rely on intimidation always reveal more than they intend to. The narrator explains what Judge Judy already knows. Threats are rarely about power. They're about insecurity. Truly powerful people don't need to announce themselves. They don't lean forward and issue warnings. They let systems work for them. And over the decades, Judge Judy had heard every variation of the same tactic: whispered threats, veiled warnings, not so subtle reminders of influence. None of them were new. What was different was how predictable they were. She had learned long ago that when someone tries to bully the court, they are usually telling you exactly where the weak spots are. They interrupt because they can't control the conversation. They smirk because they're uncomfortable. They threaten because they're afraid of what the facts might say if allowed to speak for themselves. So Judge Judy let Thomas Shelby talk. She didn't interrupt when he grew a little too confident. She didn't cut him off when his tone crossed from assertive into dismissive. She allowed him the space to become exactly what he believed he wasn't. Every word he spoke tightened the frame around him, even though he couldn't see it happening. That was the part that unnerved the audience most. Not her anger, but her restraint. Because restraint in a courtroom isn't weakness. It's precision. It's the discipline of someone who knows when to strike and when to wait. Judge Judy understood that the most effective response to arrogance is not confrontation, but exposure. Then, calmly she spoke. Not loudly. Not sharply. Just clearly. When someone threatens the court, she said, they usually don't realize the court has already investigated them. The words landed softly, and hit hard. Thomas Shelby's smile faltered for the first time. Not completely. Just enough to notice. A flicker of confusion passed across his face, as if he were replaying the sentence in his mind, searching for the angle he'd missed. His confidence didn't disappear, but it wavered. Something about the way she said it made the room feel smaller. Because that sentence carried weight far beyond the moment. It suggested preparation. It suggested patience. It suggested that this wasn't unfolding in real time, it was being revealed. Judge Judy didn't elaborate. She didn't explain what she meant. She simply looked down at the documents in front of her, as if checking something she already knew was there. The silence returned, thicker now, heavier, charged with possibility. The audience leaned in. Thomas Shelby had just crossed a line. And that line didn't trigger anger. It triggered something very different. The shift didn't happen all at once. It started quietly, almost politely, the way real trouble usually does. Thomas Shelby straightened at the podium and began telling his story again, slowly, confidently, as if repetition might turn assertion into fact. He insisted he was innocent, said this entire case was the result of a misunderstanding, a setup fueled by sloppy paperwork and people looking for someone with a name to blame. He spoke as though the truth were obvious, as though the court simply hadn't caught up yet. According to him, dates were mixed up. Forms were filed incorrectly. Conversations were taken out of context. Nothing, he claimed, reflected intent. Nothing reflected responsibility. And certainly nothing reflected him. Judge Judy listened without interruption. She didn't challenge him outright. She didn't accuse. She simply waited until he finished, then asked one question. A small one. A factual one. The kind of question that sounds harmless until you realize it's anchored to something very solid. She asked him to confirm a date. Thomas answered without hesitation. Then she asked him to confirm another, when he first became aware of the issue. His response came just as quickly. Confident. Clean. Too clean. Judge Judy nodded once and glanced at the papers in front of her. Then she asked him to repeat what he had said earlier. That's when the first crack appeared. The timeline didn't line up. Not dramatically. Not obviously. Just enough to create a quiet inconsistency, something most people wouldn't notice unless they were listening very carefully. Thomas didn't notice at all. He continued speaking, unaware that his certainty was beginning to work against him. Judge Judy asked another simple question. Then another. Each one built on the last. Each one narrowed the space where his version of events could exist. His answers started to stretch, just slightly. A pause here. A clarification there. He began adding details that hadn't been there before, explaining instead of answering. The audience felt it before he did. This wasn't an argument. It was a calibration. Judge Judy wasn't debating him, she was measuring him. And the more she measured, the more his story began to sag under its own weight. When she referenced a document in the file, Thomas waved it off immediately. Said it was outdated, incorrect, filled out by someone else. He dismissed it with the same casual confidence he'd used all morning. But when she read a line from it, one that directly mirrored something he had just said, the contradiction became impossible to ignore. His voice rose. Not sharply. Not angrily. Just enough to signal irritation. He leaned forward again, speaking faster now, as though volume could outrun the facts. He tried to reframe the question, redirect the conversation, introduce explanations that hadn't been asked for. That's when Judge Judy stopped him. I didn't ask for a speech. The words were calm, controlled, final. The effect was immediate. Thomas froze mid-sentence, mouth still slightly open, his momentum cut cleanly in half. The courtroom felt it. This was the first time his rhythm had been broken. The first time his authority had been denied oxygen. Judge Judy didn't raise her voice after that. She didn't need to. She simply repeated the question. This time, Thomas hesitated. The hesitation was subtle, but it mattered. Because in a courtroom, hesitation is where credibility starts to erode. His answer came slower now, more careful, more guarded. The certainty he'd arrived with was beginning to thin, replaced by something closer to defensiveness. The narrator makes it clear. This wasn't the collapse yet. This was the warning tremor. The early signal that the foundation underneath his story wasn't solid. The trap wasn't closing. It was being built. And Thomas Shelby was still talking his way deeper into it, one confident contradiction at a time. The room felt different now. Quieter. Tighter. The kind of silence that settles in once people realize the story they've been hearing is starting to come apart. Judge Judy didn't comment on Thomas Shelby's last answer. She didn't correct him. She simply reached for a page in the file and looked up at him again, her tone unchanged. Let's talk about what happened after that, she said. Thomas shifted his stance. Just slightly. Enough to be noticeable now. He nodded once, as if to signal cooperation, but the ease he'd carried earlier was gone. His shoulders weren't as loose. His hands no longer rested comfortably at the podium. He was still confident, but now it was a confidence under pressure. Judge Judy asked him whether he had contacted the other party outside of court. No, Thomas answered quickly. Too quickly. She nodded, as if that settled it, and turned to another document. What Thomas Shelby didn't know, what he couldn't see from where he stood, was that this part of the case had already been mapped out carefully. Judge Judy didn't introduce it with accusation. She introduced it with evidence. Phone records. She didn't dramatize it. She didn't explain where they came from. She simply stated what they showed. Multiple calls. Repeated attempts. Timing that coincided exactly with moments he had claimed there was no contact. The room stirred quietly as the implication sank in. Thomas opened his mouth to respond, but she wasn't finished. Next came the voicemail. She summarized it calmly, line by line. The tone, the language, the pressure disguised as persuasion. The not-so-subtle reminders of what could happen if cooperation wasn't offered. It wasn't shouting. It wasn't explicit. It was something more calculated. The kind of message meant to unsettle, to assert dominance without leaving fingerprints. Thomas's jaw tightened. Then came the text message. Short, direct, impossible to misinterpret. Judge Judy read it once, then looked up at him and waited. The effect was immediate. His posture changed completely. The casual lean disappeared. He stood straighter now, but not in confidence, in defense. His arms drew closer to his body. His eyes flicked briefly toward the papers, then back up again, as if hoping something on the page might save him. He tried to speak. Judge Judy stopped him with a raised hand. "No," she said simply. "You'll listen." The interruption landed harder than any gavel. Thomas had controlled conversations his entire life by talking over people, by pushing forward before they could respond. For the first time, that strategy failed. He closed his mouth, breathing through his nose, the muscles in his face tightening as the courtroom watched. The narrator underscores the moment. This wasn't about one call or one message. It was about pattern, about intent, about someone who claimed innocence while leaving a trail of pressure behind them. The intimidation he denied in court had been preserved, word for word, outside of it. Judge Judy didn't accuse him of wrongdoing yet. She didn't label his behavior. She simply asked him to explain the difference between his testimony and what was now documented in front of everyone. Thomas hesitated. The hesitation stretched longer this time. Long enough for the audience to feel it. Long enough for the certainty he'd walked in with to finally crack. He began to respond, then stopped himself, recalibrating mid-sentence. The smoothness was gone. What remained was reaction. And that's when Judge Judy leaned forward slightly and asked him one final question. A question he was not prepared to answer. The realization didn't hit Thomas Shelby all at once. It crept in slowly, like water seeping through cracks he didn't know were there. His eyes flicked again to the documents in Judge Judy's hands. His jaw tightened. The rhythm he had relied on, confidence, control, pressure, was gone. For the first time since he'd stepped into the courtroom, he understood something fundamental had shifted. He was losing, and Thomas Shelby had never learned how to lose quietly. He straightened, drawing in a breath that was meant to restore authority but only exposed strain. His voice, when he spoke again, was still measured, but sharper now, edged with frustration. He didn't answer the question Judge Judy had just asked. Instead, he redirected. He spoke about how this was being handled unfairly, how reputations could be damaged, how people with influence didn't appreciate being misrepresented. The words were familiar. So was the tactic. Then he said it again. Not the exact same sentence, but the same message, stripped of subtlety. He spoke of consequences, of how this situation could go further than anyone wanted, of how things could become uncomfortable. He implied scrutiny, pressure, fallout. His tone wasn't loud, but it carried weight. The kind meant to remind someone that power doesn't disappear just because a camera is on. The courtroom reacted instantly. A sharp intake of breath from the gallery. A murmur that rippled and then died just as quickly. Even people who hadn't fully followed the case felt it now. This wasn't frustration anymore. This was a threat being restated, clearer than before, aimed directly at the bench. Thomas Shelby had doubled down. He seemed to expect resistance. An argument. A warning. Something to push against. What he didn't expect was how little effort it took for Judge Judy to dismantle him. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't look offended. She didn't react the way he wanted her to. She looked at him calmly, almost thoughtfully, as if deciding whether he truly understood what he'd just done. Then she spoke. "Sir," she said evenly, "threatening a judge is not a strategy. It's a confession." The words landed with surgical precision. No drama. No emphasis. Just truth, delivered without emotion. Thomas froze. Whatever he had been preparing to say next evaporated. His mouth opened slightly, then closed. The color drained from his face, not suddenly, but enough to be visible. The sentence replayed itself in his mind, and for the first time, he grasped the gravity of what had just happened. Judge Judy didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. Everyone in that courtroom understood the implication. Threats weren't leverage here. They were evidence. And he had just offered it voluntarily, on camera, in his own words. The narrator lets the moment breathe. This was the point of no return. The instant when arrogance stops being a shield and becomes a liability. Viewers watching would later describe it the same way. You could see it on his face. The exact second he realized he'd gone too far. Thomas Shelby had walked in believing power would protect him. Now he understood something far worse. Power had just exposed him. And everyone watching knew it. The hammer hadn't fallen yet, but it was coming. The courtroom didn't explode into noise after the threat. It sank into something heavier. Judge Judy took a moment before speaking again, not to gather her thoughts, but to let the weight of what had just happened settle where it belonged. Thomas Shelby stood rigid at the podium now, no longer leaning, no longer relaxed. The confidence he had worn so comfortably at the start of the case had vanished, replaced by a tense stillness that betrayed how quickly the ground had shifted beneath him. Judge Judy began calmly, the same measured tone she had used all morning. She explained that credibility in a courtroom isn't built on confidence or connections. It's built on consistency. And when someone's story changes under simple questioning, when timelines shift, explanations multiply, and pressure replaces clarity, that credibility erodes. Not slowly. Completely. Then she addressed the threat. She made it clear that intimidation doesn't strengthen a case. It exposes it. When a person resorts to pressure, to implications of influence or consequence, they aren't demonstrating authority. They are confirming intent, confirming awareness, confirming that they understand the stakes and are trying to outrun them. Thomas opened his mouth to respond. Judge Judy stopped him immediately. "No," she said. "You've spoken enough." The denial landed harder than any argument. He stood there, hands tightening at his sides, eyes fixed forward, unable to interrupt, unable to redirect, unable to perform the control he had relied on for so long. Judge Judy continued. She explained that the court does not evaluate threats as emotional outbursts. It evaluates them as behavior. Behavior that speaks louder than testimony. Behavior that, in this case, aligned perfectly with the evidence already presented. The calls, the messages, the contradictions. Together, they painted a picture that no amount of confidence could erase. Her ruling followed without hesitation. It was decisive, complete. Maximum penalties allowed under the court's authority. Clear consequences for conduct, not just claims, and language that made it unmistakable. This behavior would not end here. It would be noted. It would be addressed. It would follow him. Thomas tried to speak again. Judge Judy didn't look up. I said no. That was it. The room felt suspended in time as she delivered the final sentence, eyes steady, voice unwavering. This court is not afraid of you, she said. But you should be afraid of what you just did. The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. They landed exactly where they were meant to. Thomas Shelby stood frozen, the full consequence of his choices finally visible on his face. There was no outrage now. No threat. No performance. Just the quiet collapse of a man who had mistaken intimidation for immunity. The narrator closes the moment with clarity. This wasn't about winning or losing a case. It was about what happens when someone brings arrogance into a room governed by law. When they confuse power with pressure. When they forget that in a courtroom, authority doesn't shout. It waits. And then it ends you. This was why it was a very big mistake. As the courtroom began to empty, there was no celebration, no victory speech, no last attempt at saving face. Thomas Shelby walked out the same way he had walked in, alone, but nothing about him looked the same. The posture was gone. The certainty was gone. What remained was exposure. Not just of a failed case, but of a mindset that had finally met a boundary it couldn't bend. That's the lesson this moment leaves behind. Power fails in a courtroom because power is loud. It relies on pressure, reputation, and fear. Authority doesn't need any of that. Authority doesn't respond to threats. It doesn't negotiate with intimidation. It waits, it listens, and it allows people to reveal themselves fully, then it acts. Thomas Shelby believed influence could protect him. He believed confidence could replace credibility. He believed the rules applied differently to him. And for a long time, that belief probably served him well. Until it didn't. Until he stepped into a room where none of it mattered. Judge Judy didn't defeat him with anger. She didn't overpower him with volume. She let the facts speak, let his behavior complete the story, and let his own words close the door behind him. That's why this moment resonated with millions of people. Because it wasn't about punishment, it was about accountability. There's something deeply satisfying about watching arrogance collapse under calm authority. Not loudly, not chaotically, but completely. So now the question turns to you. Should threats in a courtroom carry automatic penalties? And have you ever seen arrogance collapse this fast? Let us know in the comments.